The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects. Megan O'Brien stood in the parking lot of Oak Creek Memorial, rain hammering the asphalt around her boots, and felt the weight of invisibility settle across her shoulders like a familiar coat. 6 months of driving past this hospital. 6 months of knowing she'd have to walk through these doors eventually. Now the moment had arrived, and her hands were steady. They always were. She'd spent the last 4 years building a life where nobody asked questions. A studio apartment in Northeast Portland. A job at a clinic that didn't care about gaps in employment history. A new name in every database, not legally, nothing that formal, just a quiet erasure of the woman she used to be. The woman who'd commanded field hospitals in Ramadi. The woman whose hands had held 17 Marines alive when the dust cleared and the screaming stopped. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien didn't exist anymore. The Navy had let her walk away without protest, which told her everything about how badly the PTSD had carved her into pieces they couldn't use. But Admiral James Kincaid existed. And he was upstairs in this hospital, machines breathing for him. The rain soaked through her jacket as she crossed the lot. Her daughter didn't know. Her ex-husband didn't know. Nobody knew where she'd gone or why she'd left, just that one morning she'd packed a duffel bag and driven north without stopping. The nightmares had gotten worse, the kind where she woke up screaming at 3 a.m., her body convinced it was still 2009, still in a combat hospital that smelled like copper and diesel and human failure. She couldn't heal other people anymore. Not with her hands shaking. Not with her mind fractured into pieces that didn't fit back together right. So she'd become invisible instead. The emergency room doors slid open with a hydraulic wheeze. The smell hit her first, that particular blend of antiseptic and stale coffee and something underneath both that never quite washed out. Megan had smelled it 1,000 times before, in a place where the walls were canvas and the surgeries happened under generator light. Here it lived in the linoleum and the walls and the genetic memory of every critical moment that had passed through these corridors. Her chest tightened. She forced it loose with a breath that came from her diaphragm, the way she'd been taught. The night shift supervisor was a thin woman named Patricia with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the kind of exhausted efficiency that came from managing chaos for 20 years. She barely glanced up from her desk when Megan approached. "You're the new hire from the staffing agency." "Megan." She let the name sit there without elaboration. Just Megan. No history. No service record. No medals gathering dust in a box somewhere. "Patricia. We're short on the 4th floor tonight," one of our regulars called out. "You've worked nights before." "Yes. Charting system's going to be different from whatever clinic you came from, but you'll pick it up fast. Main thing is don't fall behind on vitals. Dr. Sterling runs a tight ship up there, and he notices when the numbers aren't current." Patricia slid a badge across the desk. It was plastic and generic and had her photograph on it, just Megan, no rank, no history, no proof of what she'd actually been. "Orientation's tomorrow at 8. Tonight, just shadow Maria on the floor. She'll show you the rhythm. The 4th floor. Cardiac unit." Megan had reviewed the hospital directory online during her 3rd sleepless night, had memorized which ward held each category of patient. Admiral Kincaid was in for 47. Long-term critical care. 5 years comatose after a stroke in his shower, no indication of meaningful recovery, family visiting less frequently over time until even they seemed to have accepted that he was just a body now, just a biological machine running through its final program. She clipped the badge to her scrubs and climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator. For flights. Her thighs burned by the second landing, which surprised her until she remembered she hadn't been running. Hadn't been doing anything physical except moving through days with the minimum effort required to keep breathing. The stairs felt good. The burn felt like proof she was still here. The 4th floor hallway was softer than the emergency room. Dimmer lighting. The beeping of monitors from each room blending into a kind of white noise that sounded like a heartbeat. Maria was waiting at the nurse's station, a round woman in her 50s with the kind of competence that came from doing this for 30 years without getting crushed by it. She handed Megan a tablet and started walking. 6 patients on night shift. Dr. Sterling makes rounds in the morning, so if anything goes wrong, you call that button on the wall and announce your name clearly. He hates surprises. Maria gestured toward a room. Post-op knee replacement. Vitals every 2 hours until he's off the pain medication. He'll sleep through the night if we're lucky. They moved past room after room. Megan nodded and took notes she wouldn't need because her memory for medical details had never dimmed, not even through the years she'd spent trying to forget everything else. The rhythm of the ward was familiar in a way that felt like coming home and being stabbed simultaneously. This one's transfer from downstairs, been here 6 weeks, should be discharged within. Room for 47. Megan's voice was steady. Conversational. Just a nurse asking about a patient. Maria checked her tablet. You're wondering about him already? Dr. Sterling likes to keep him isolated, not many visitors. Family stopped coming about 18 months ago. She paused at the threshold. Admiral James Kincaid. Navy career that spanned 42 years before the stroke. Retirement here since it happened, no meaningful neurological activity for the duration. He's a DNR, so if something happens, we make him comfortable and wait. Megan stepped into the room. The machines were humming their patient mechanical songs. Ventilator. Monitor. For pump delivering nutrients into a vein that didn't know the difference anymore. The Admiral lay in the bed like something that had been carved from marble and left behind, his face still strong despite the 5 years of paralysis, his jaw still carrying the architecture of command even though he couldn't command his own lungs to breathe. She recognized him immediately. Older than her memory held him, thinner in the face, but unmistakably him. She'd seen his photograph exactly once, in a briefing 17 years ago about unit command structure in Ramadi. He'd given an order that day that had routed 2 blood supplies meant for her field hospital to a combat operation 4 kilometers north. 7 of her corpsmen had died in the fight while she waited for supplies that never came. One of those corpsmen had been her son. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath stayed level. Her face remained the carefully blank canvas she'd been practicing for 4 years. You'll check his lines every shift, Maria was saying. Monitor for signs of infection or skin breakdown. He's got a physical therapist who comes twice a week to work his joints so they don't seize up completely. Mostly though, he just exists. And we take care of him because that's what we do. The Admiral's chest rose and fell in rhythm with the ventilator. The 4 was running clear. His skin color was decent for someone who hadn't moved in 1,825 days. Megan reached down without thinking about it and straightened the blanket covering his right hand, a small gesture that belonged to the person she used to be, not the person she'd become. He ever have any response? Megan asked. Any indication he hears things? Not that we've seen. Some of the family used to talk to him at first. Nothing ever changed. Dr. Sterling says the neurological damage was extensive. Maria moved back toward the door. You'll get used to the quiet ones. They're easier than the ones who are conscious, honestly. They don't need anything you can actually give them. But Megan was staring at the Admiral's right hand, at the way his fingers had twitched just slightly when she'd touched the blanket. She'd trained for 11 years to read subtle signs in human physiology. Signs that meant the difference between life and death. Signs that most people missed because they weren't looking for them. She was looking. Down the hallway, the elevator doors slid open with that same hydraulic wheeze. A man in a 3-piece suit stepped out, of expensive fabric, the kind that came from shopping at places that didn't display prices, and his presence immediately changed the air pressure of the corridor. This was Dr. Sterling. Megan recognized him from the hospital website photo, though the image hadn't captured the way he moved like someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. He was making rounds at 11:13 p.m., which meant something. Megan filed that away. Maria. His voice carried the tone of someone who'd internalized the concept that he was the most important person in every room. I need the charts for 417 and 423. And the new hire, come here. Megan turned. She walked toward him with the measured pace she perfected over 4 years of invisibility. Not too fast. Not too slow. Nothing threatening. Nothing memorable. Dr. Sterling looked her over the way someone might examine equipment they'd just acquired. His eyes moved across her face, her scrubs, her name badge, and dismissed her all in the same motion. New people always make mistakes on the charting. Don't fall behind. I run a profitable operation here, which means I run a clean operation. Follow the protocols, don't ask questions, and you'll last longer than the last 3 nurses we had in your position. He turned away before she could respond. Maria, my office. We need to discuss the supply shipment. They walked away. The hallway went quiet again except for the monitors. Megan returned to room for 47 and stood in the doorway for exactly 30 seconds, watching the Admiral's chest rise and fall. Watching his right hand. Watching for something she couldn't quite name. Then she went back to the nurse's station and began reviewing charts with the kind of attention that would become her burden and her salvation both, because Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had been trained to notice things that nobody else could see, and that training had never actually switched off. It had just been waiting. Dormant. Ready. And the Admiral's vital signs, she was already noting, didn't quite match what Dr. Sterling's morning documentation claimed they should be. The morning shift staff hadn't even clocked in when Dr. Sterling made his announcement. He stood in the cafeteria with his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, 14-karat gold cufflinks catching the fluorescent overhead, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. 23 nurses, for residents, the entire support staff turning to listen. That new night shift nurse. He smiled like a predator. The quiet one. I'm giving her a week. 1 week before she realizes this job is too much and disappears back to whatever volunteer clinic was desperate enough to hire her. He took a sip of his coffee. Any takers? I've got 500 on the table. The room didn't go dead silent. It went something worse, it went complicit. A few doctors laughed. A surgical tech nodded. One resident even said, "That's generous. I give her 3 days." No one contradicted him. No one stood up and said that wasn't how you treated people. They just let it hang there in the stale cafeteria air, along with the smell of burnt coffee and the underlying current of institutional power that made it clear Sterling had already decided Megan's fate. Megan wasn't there to hear it. She was in room for 47, checking Admiral Kincaid's medication times against his documentation, noting the small discrepancies that kept accumulating like loose threads in a tapestry. 2 procedures billed that hadn't been performed. Oxygen settings recorded at levels the Admiral's lungs couldn't have tolerated. Equipment charges for items she'd never seen on the cart. The patterns were there. They were just quiet. Just like her. But Sterling knew. Word traveled fast through hospital networks, whispered conversations, overheard concerns, the way Megan asked questions that didn't sound deferential. Why was the Admiral on that particular antibiotic when his chart showed no documented infection? Why had a specialist been called in for a procedure that never happened? The kind of questions that made people like Sterling nervous. Very nervous. It was 11:44 a.m. when he saw her in the cafeteria line. Megan was reaching for her tray, turkey sandwich, water, apple, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that marked her as someone who'd never learned to waste motion. She was already turning to leave, already thinking about the next 12-hour shift, when Sterling passed by and let his arm swing wide. Casual. Almost accidental. The tray clattered to the floor. Applesauce splattered across the tile. The sandwich landed butter side down like a prophecy. Oh. Sorry about that. Sterling didn't stop walking. He didn't apologize. He said the words the way someone comments on weather, like the thing on the floor didn't matter, like the person attached to that tray didn't matter. Around them, staff members pretended not to notice. One nurse made a throat sound that might have been suppressed laughter. The message was clear: watch what happens when you ask the wrong questions. Megan took one measured breath. She knelt down and began cleaning the mess with paper towels from the dispenser, moving with the same careful precision she used for everything else. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't shake. She simply wiped the tile clean, deposited the napkins in the bin, and stood up. Someone was watching her, she could feel it, but she didn't look to see who. By evening, Sterling had escalated. He appeared at the nursing station with a patient chart in his hand, his expression arranged in something that resembled pleasant amusement. Megan was updating the evening notes, documenting Admiral Kincaid's vitals and the medication she'd administered. The chart Sterling held was from another patient, a follow-up case he had no reason to hand to her directly, but that was the point, wasn't it? Power moves weren't about reason. He dropped it at her feet. The pages fanned across the floor like her accusation. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice had that particular cadence, not angry, which would have been honest. Instead it was something worse. Patronizing. Casual. The tone you used when you were absolutely certain someone beneath you would comply. When you were certain you'd already won. Megan stared at the chart for exactly 2 seconds. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like agitated hornets. She could hear the distant sound of a monitor alarming in another room, the soft footstep of an orderly passing by, the sound of Sterling's breathing, short and self-satisfied. She'd picked up worse than papers. She'd picked up lives from worse places than hospital floors. She'd picked up 17 Marines from a field hospital in Ramadi while mortars impacted in the distance, their blood soaking through her sleeves, their weight against her body, their voices asking if they were going to die. She'd held them while the medevac helicopter descended, while rounds punched through the tent, while the desert itself seemed determined to steal them away. She took another measured breath. One tear escaped, just one, tracking down her cheek. She didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact with Sterling. She wiped it away with one deliberate motion and in that same motion knelt down and picked up the pages. Then she straightened, chart in hand, and spoke in a voice like still water. "I've picked up better men than you from worse places than this floor." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside. Sterling's expression didn't change. That was what made it worse. He didn't look angry or shocked. He looked satisfied. He'd gotten exactly what he wanted, her to react, her to acknowledge his power, her to prove that she was breakable. Good. See that it doesn't happen again. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. What he didn't realize was that Megan had seen the thing he'd missed while standing over her. In the split second when she bent to collect the pages, she'd caught sight of his handwritten note on the inside cover of another patient's chart, a quick calculation of billing codes, equipment charges, the kind of financial notation that didn't belong anywhere near medical documentation. It was the kind of detail most nurses would have overlooked. Would have filed away without connecting it to the other patterns she'd been quietly noticing. But Megan had been trained to see things. To interpret small signals in the dark. To understand when the pieces didn't fit. The night shift was coming. 2:13 a.m., the witching hour when tired doctors make tired decisions, when skeleton crews meant that one person might have to manage an emergency alone, when things went wrong with no witnesses. Sterling thought he'd broken her with that public humiliation, with the tray and the chart and the diminishing diminutive. But he didn't understand what Megan had already survived. He didn't know who he'd hired. And he had no idea what was about to arrive through the emergency department doors. The call came in at 2:38 a.m. Incoming trauma. Multi-vehicle collision on I-405 northbound, just past the Morrison Bridge. 3 patients. ETA for minutes. The ER burst into motion, controlled chaos that only looked chaotic to people who'd never worked trauma. Surgeons stirring from the on-call room. Residents jogging toward the trauma bays. Equipment being pulled and verified and staged. Anesthesia checking their intubation trays while nurses cut off the arrival's clothing and established for access. Megan was in the break room, reading the same page of her book she'd been reading for the past hour, when the announcement blared over the overhead speaker. Incoming trauma, 3 patients, ETA for minutes. She was moving before the announcement finished. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own, pulling on a fresh pair of latex gloves, checking the suction setup, verifying that the chest tube kit was ready. Her movements were economical. Precise. The kind of movements that only came from doing something 1,000 times. Because she had. In a field hospital. Under fire. With supplies that were half what she needed and casualties that tripled what anyone could manage. The first ambulance pulled up and the paramedics rolled the stretcher in, calling vitals as they moved. 42-year-old female, restrained driver, struck on the passenger side, unconscious on scene, GCS of 8, bilateral femur fractures, active hemorrhage from the left leg, lost about a litre en route, BP 94/61 and dropping. Dr. Sterling was already there, he'd been sleeping in the call room, and he took the case immediately. First priority trauma. The kind that separated the competent from the lucky. The second ambulance brought a second patient. Then the third. The trauma bays filled with sound, the hiss of oxygen, the beeping of monitors, the voice of a resident calling for units of O-negative blood, the rhythmic compression of CPR happening in the corner. Megan moved between patients, doing what nurses did, managing the chaos, anticipating what the doctors needed before they asked, reading the monitors and translating the numbers into data that could save lives. Then the third patient coded. His name was Robert Chen. 37. Motorcycle versus sedan. He'd been conscious when he arrived, talking, cursing about the stupid driver who'd cut him off, asking about his wife. But that was 12 minutes ago. Now his oxygen saturation was dropping and his chest wasn't rising symmetrically, and the attending physician, not Sterling, thank God, but a woman named Reeves, was calling for an immediate chest X-ray. Get a line in, Dr. Reeves ordered. A resident fumbled with the needle. Missed. Tried again on the other arm. Missed again. The oxygen sat was dropping from 92 to 87 to 82 to 78. The room began moving faster. Someone was calling for the surgeon. Someone else was pushing epinephrine. And Dr. Sterling appeared beside the bed, took one look at the monitor, and made the kind of error that killed people. He ordered a central line. Immediate. In a patient whose trachea was deviating. Whose neck veins were bulging with the precise appearance of someone whose right lung had collapsed under pressure and was compressing everything in the mediastinum. A patient who needed a needle inserted into the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, with the kind of immediacy that didn't leave time for debate. A tension pneumothorax. The kind of thing that could kill you in minutes. Megan saw it. She was standing at the monitor, vitals falling, O2 at 74, and her vision shifted. For exactly 3 seconds, the Portland hospital dissolved. The beeping became mortar fire. The antiseptic became desert dust. She was in Ramadi again, in the field hospital tent, Marines coming in with sucking chest wounds and nobody with the authority to do the procedures that would save them. She remembered the feeling of helplessness. The realization that she had the training but not the rank. That the doctor, the one in charge, was making decisions based on protocol rather than the patient in front of him. She blinked. The desert was gone. Needle decompression. Now. Megan spoke it like it wasn't a suggestion. The resident holding the central line kit looked at her with confusion. Dr. Reeves looked at her with surprise. And Sterling looked at her with something that might have been outrage that a nurse had just issued a command in his presence. I've got this, he said coldly. Stand down. But the patient's oxygen was at 71. The patient's blood pressure was 62/40. The patient was about to die because a doctor was following protocol instead of saving his life. Megan reached into the crash cart, the one she'd been standing next to the entire time, and pulled out the 14-gauge angiocath needle with movements so fluid they looked like she was pulling it from her own body. She located the second rib on the patient's right side, the midclavicular line, and in a single motion that took maybe 4 seconds inserted the needle into the pleural space. The hiss of air escaping from the pressure cavity was audible across the entire room. Then the oxygen monitor climbed. 74, 78. 82, 88. The patient's blood pressure ticked back up. 65, 70. 78. Sinus rhythm. The room went absolutely silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that only happened when everyone realized they'd just watched something that shouldn't have been possible. Sterling's face had gone the color of old bone. And the patient, Robert Chen, looked at her with eyes that had gone from panic to clear. His pupils focused. He inhaled without the breathing machine doing it for him. And then his mouth moved and he whispered two words that made everything else irrelevant. Senior Chief. The monitor screamed at 3:22 a.m. Megan was 2 corridors away, restocking the medication cart on the 3rd floor when the alarm bells from room 447 cut through the fluorescent hum like a siren through fog. She didn't run. Running drew attention. She walked, that careful, measured pace that had kept her invisible for 6 days, but her heart was already shifting into a rhythm she'd spent years trying to forget. By the time she crossed the threshold, the attending physician was already there, Dr. Morrison, a competent man in his 50s who froze the moment he saw the monitors. The Admiral's oxygen saturation was dropping fast. 94, 91. 87. The ventilator was fighting something, struggling to push air into tissue that wasn't receiving it. "Get me a setup," Morrison said, but his voice had that quality, the brittle edge of a doctor who'd seen too many bad outcomes and wasn't sure which direction to move. Megan's eyes moved across the patient's body like a scanner reading a map. There. The trachea was deviated to the left. His neck veins were distended, bulging against the skin like they were trying to escape. His chest wall wasn't moving symmetrically. The left side was still. Dead still. Tension pneumothorax. The room tilted for a half-second. Not here. Not now. She was in Ramadi again. The blast had come through the south wall of the aid station, and 3 men were bleeding out and the ventilator was doing that exact same fight for air sound, and her son was supposed to be in the convoy but nobody knew where, and Morrison was calling for a needle, calling for somebody to help him, but his hands were shaking and the patient was going to die if. "Senior Chief, we need a 14 gauge. The words came out of her mouth in a voice that didn't belong to the woman who'd been pushed around by Dr. Sterling for 6 days. This voice was different. Deeper. Clipped at the edges like a command, not a request. Morrison's head snapped toward her. "What did you?" "Anterior thoracic wall. 2nd intercostal, midclavicular line. Needle decompression. Now." She was already moving. Hand steady as a surgeon's laser, she tore open the angiocath kit. The plastic peeled back with a sharp whisper against the antiseptic-soaked air. She located the landmark on the Admiral's chest, that space between the ribs where the air was trapped, pressing his organs sideways, strangling his heart with physics and bad luck. "Step back," she said to Morrison. It wasn't a request. He stepped back. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, aiming up and over the 3rd rib to avoid the intercostal vessels. Her thumb was steady. Her breath didn't hitch. The moment the catheter cleared the pleura, the room filled with a hiss, the sound of pressure equaling, of physics surrendering, of trapped air escaping like a held breath finally released. The ventilator immediately sighed easier. "Oxygen climbing," Morrison said, his voice small now, almost confused. 75, 78. 82. Megan didn't look at him. She was already securing the catheter with one hand while her eyes tracked the monitor with the other. The heart rate was still elevated but stabilizing. The rhythm was holding. 88, 92. "Stable," Morrison whispered. The Admiral's chest rose and fell in sync with the ventilator now, that synthetic breath becoming organic again through sheer mechanical correction. Megan stepped back. One controlled breath. Then another. Her hands were dry. Her voice was level. "Chest tube," she said to Morrison. "He'll need a formal intervention. This is a bridge." Morrison was staring at her. Not at the patient. At her. His eyes had gone wide in that particular way that meant he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see, and now he was trying to reconcile it with the quiet night shift nurse who'd been making coffee and asking polite questions for 6 days. That's when she noticed his eyes dropping. Not to her face. To her hands. The scars on her wrists caught the monitor light, long surgical lines, old and pale, running from her inner wrist up toward her elbow. Field dressing scars. Combat medic scars. The kind you got when you were holding someone's artery together with your bare hands and the bleeding wouldn't stop and there was no surgical suite, just sand and screaming and the weight of choices nobody should have to make. His gaze traveled upward. To the small tattoo on her collarbone, barely visible where her scrubs didn't quite cover it. A Navy insignia she'd been careful to hide for 6 days. Just a ghost of ink that said everything. You? Morrison started, but Megan was already moving toward the equipment cart. Get a chest tube set up. Call thoracic surgery. Tell them we have a stable pneumothorax waiting for intervention. Each word came out like a checklist, efficient and cold. And Dr. Morrison? The Admiral is stable. The rest is just procedure. She didn't wait for him to respond. She could feel his confusion radiating like heat as she passed him, could feel the moment he was about to say something else, ask something else, but the Admiral's blood pressure was climbing, the saturation was holding steady at 92, and there was work to do. The monitors beeped their mechanical song. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3 steps back to the door. Her hand reached for the intercom button, and that's when she heard it, a sound so quiet most people would have missed it. The Admiral's eyes. Moving. Just slightly. Tracking toward her voice. The faintest sound escaping his throat, fighting past the ventilator tube. Reap. The word died there. Incomplete. But enough. Morrison heard it too. She could see his face change in her peripheral vision, saw the moment the pieces started to fit together in his head. Senior Chief. Scars like that. A command voice like she'd been carrying it for years. And now a patient calling her something that sounded like a call sign, something only people who'd served in a certain place, with a certain unit, would ever say. Megan didn't look back. She pressed the intercom button, her voice still that strange, low, controlled thing. Thoracic surgery to room for 47. We have a stable pneumothorax, patient is conscious, vitals holding. The intercom crackled back confirmation, and in that moment of static and distance, Megan O'Brien, the invisible night shift nurse, was already disappearing, like something stepping back into shadow. But something else was stepping forward now, something that had been buried but never dead, something that recognized the sound of its own name spoken by a man she'd tried to save 5 years ago in a war that wouldn't let her go. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to what they'd just witnessed. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor beeped its steady song. And somewhere on the 3rd floor of Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Morrison was staring at the space where she'd been standing, trying to make sense of a Navy that didn't exist on any current roster, didn't exist in any database he could access, didn't exist in the official record of who was working night shift in Portland, Oregon. But the Admiral knew. The Admiral remembered. And that knowledge was about to tear open the careful architecture of Megan's new life. Within hours, the board investigator arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with a manila folder thick enough to choke on. His name was Patterson. He wore the careful, neutral expression of a man who had been paid to ask difficult questions without caring about the answers. Dr. Sterling had prepared the ground well, 3 separate complaints filed by former colleagues, all with timestamps conveniently placed during Megan's shifts, all describing protocol violations that had never happened. The investigator found her at 3:22 p.m. on the 6th floor, pulling supplies from a medication cart. Megan O'Brien? Patterson's voice carried the weight of bureaucracy, the sound of a system grinding forward with indifferent momentum. She turned. The folder came open in his hands like a wound. He read aloud, insubordination, improper procedure, failure to report to attending physician before administering care. Each accusation landed like a stone dropped into still water. Megan listened without interrupting. Her hands continued their work, reaching, organizing, moving with the precision of someone whose mind had learned long ago to separate body from consequence. "There's an emergency board review scheduled for 4:45 p.m., Patterson said. "You'll need to be present." She nodded once. Didn't ask questions. Didn't defend herself. The silence between them stretched thin and elastic. The review lasted 17 minutes. 5 hospital administrators sat behind a table that made them appear taller than they actually were. Dr. Sterling stood to one side, his posture the picture of wounded professionalism, a man betrayed by a junior staff member who had overstepped her authority in a moment of heroic impulse. He presented it carefully, not as malice, but as protocol. She had acted without consulting the attending physician. She had taken charge of a patient in cardiac crisis without explicit authorization. Technically, he was correct. Technically, she had violated the chain of command. Megan sat in a plastic chair across from them. She wore her scrubs. Her badge hung at her neck. She did not cry. She did not protest. When they asked her to explain her actions, she gave them the truth in exactly 12 words: the patient was dying. I acted. The patient lived. One of the administrators, a woman whose name tag read Dr. Reeves, shifted uncomfortably. The others exchanged glances that meant they were uncomfortable but committed. Dr. Sterling cleared his throat. Regardless of intent, protocol exists for a reason. Patient safety requires clear lines of authority. The irony hung in the air like anesthesia gas, sharp and invisible. Everyone in the room except the board members understood what had actually happened. They knew. But knowing and acting were different countries separated by a border no one wanted to cross. Effective immediately, the board chair said, a man whose voice sounded like it had been trained to deliver bad news: your employment is terminated. Grounds: failure to follow established chain of command and protocol violations resulting in administrative procedures being circumvented. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Megan stood. She unpinned her badge from her scrubs, the small rectangular card with her photo and credentials, the thing that had allowed her to exist in the margins of this place. She set it on the table in front of them. No one reached for it immediately. It sat there like an artifact, something already belonging to the past. I understand, she said. She walked out of the room without looking at Dr. Sterling, without acknowledging the flicker of triumph in his expression. The hallway stretched before her, neutral and long, fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical song. Her locker was in the basement break room. She descended 2 flights of stairs. Her boots echoed on the concrete. The stairwell smelled like old coffee and cleaning supplies. Her locker opened with the same key she had used for 8 months. Inside, 2 extra pairs of scrubs, a plastic water bottle, a laminated photo of her surviving daughter from 4 years ago when contact still existed, and at the bottom, wrapped in a canvas bag, the pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan, laces frayed, leather cracked from 7,000 hours of walking through places that were supposed to break people but hadn't broken her. Not in the way they were supposed to. She held the boots for a long moment. They felt heavier than they should. She packed them carefully, then placed everything into a cardboard box she found on a shelf. The box was the size of a showbox but deeper, the kind that had once held medical supplies. Now it held a woman's entire secondary identity, compressed into something that could be carried with one hand. Security escorted her to her car at 5:13 p.m. A man named Torres, whom she had worked alongside for 3 months and who had never once asked her questions about why she sometimes woke from her breaks looking like she had been drowning in still water. He was apologetic, embarrassed. She told him it wasn't his fault. She meant it. He was simply the mechanism through which the system moved. The rain started 3 hours later. Megan was sitting on a bench at the 24-hour transit station on Morrison Street, 15 blocks from Oak Creek Memorial, watching the precipitation fall in sheets that seemed to have weight and intention. The bus stop had a partial shelter, but not enough. Water ran down her neck and soaked through her jacket. She didn't move. The cold felt like information, like data she was supposed to process and understand. Her phone had one missed call. A number she didn't recognize. She didn't call back. The cardboard box sat beside her on the bench. The boots inside felt like a question she couldn't answer. 73 months of active service. 3 deployments. 2 Purple Hearts from incidents she never discussed. A Navy Cross commendation she had never worn publicly. 17 Marines who were alive only because she had refused to follow the order to evacuate the field hospital in Fallujah. 17 people who had children and spouses who existed only because Megan O'Brien had made a choice that was officially mutiny but unofficially just the sound of someone's conscience overriding their rank. She had left all of that behind when she walked away. No discharge ceremony. No retirement party. Just a request for separation, processed quietly through channels that didn't ask questions, in exchange for her agreement to silence. Non-disclosure clauses like locks on a door she had decided to close. And then she became someone else. Someone named Megan instead of senior chief. Someone who pushed medicine carts instead of commanding trauma teams. Someone who told her daughter nothing, because how do you explain that you had chosen invisibility to survive? 3 days later, Megan sat in a waiting room at the VA hospital on SW Barber Boulevard. The fluorescent lights cast everything in the color of old regret. Around her sat 30 other people in various states of damage, a man with an amputated leg reading a Tom Clancy novel, a woman with PTSD medication tremors folding and refolding a hospital brochure, a younger veteran whose 1,000-yard stare suggested he was looking at something no one else in the room could see. These were her people. She had treated dozens like them in field hospitals where the morphine ran out and the sun never stopped burning down on the wounded. She had walked past all of them without acknowledgement. They didn't recognize her. She was just another body in the waiting room, just another veteran checking a box on an intake form that asked about anxiety and insomnia and intrusive thoughts and the sound of your own heartbeat when you were trying to sleep but couldn't because sleep meant dreams and dreams meant remedy. The intake form was 19 pages. Question 7 asked about her military service. She wrote, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Navy, 3 tours, 2009 to 2016. The ink looked like it was confessing. Question 14 asked about her current employment. She left it blank. Question 18 asked about her support system. She left that blank too. A nurse named Rodriguez called her name at 6:38 p.m. Rodriguez was young, maybe 26, with the kind of competence that came from knowing you were good at something and not needing anyone to validate it. Megan stood to follow her into the consultation area. As she passed the waiting room, she saw his face. One of the veterans she had treated in Ramadi, Lance Corporal Matthews, who had taken fragmentation wounds to his right shoulder and whose blood type she still remembered because she had typed and crossed it 4 times in a single 8-hour shift. He didn't recognize her. He was reading a 6-month-old Sports Illustrated with his left hand because his right arm trembled too much for fine motor control. She kept walking. Rodriguez led her down a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and institutional resignation. The counselor's office was small and warm and designed to be soothing. A woman named Dr. Patel sat behind a desk covered in case files. She had the tired eyes of someone who had been listening to trauma stories for long enough that nothing shocked her anymore, which was its own form of damage. Let's start with why you're here, Dr. Patel said. Megan's hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the effort of holding everything in. From 7 years of compression finally reaching pressure points the container could no longer sustain. From 3 days of silence that had been loud enough to hear. I can't do it anymore, Megan said. The words came out flat and factual, the way she might report vital signs, patient exhibiting signs of complete structural failure, recommend immediate intervention. Do what? Dr. Patel's pen was poised over her notepad, ready to write down the things people said when they stopped pretending. This. All of it. Being someone else. Being invisible. Megan's voice stayed level, but something in her face had shifted, like a door opening just wide enough to let the light through. I was a senior chief. I commanded trauma teams. I kept people breathing when every protocol said to let them die. And now she gestured at the box of belongings on the floor beside her chair. I'm nobody. I'm working night shifts in a hospital where the doctors think they're smarter than they are, and I'm good at it, I'm better than all of them, and I can't tell anyone because I signed away the right to be who I actually am. Dr. Patel wrote something down. Then she looked up. What changed? Why now? I did something right, Megan said. I saved a life the way I was trained to save lives. And they fired me for it. The sentence hung between them like a statement of purpose. Dr. Patel set down her pen and folded her hands. She didn't offer comfort. She just listened. Which was exactly what Megan needed, and exactly what she hadn't let herself have in 7 years. Outside, rain continued its percussion against the building. Megan's phone sat on the desk beside the intake form. It had been silent all day. No calls. No messages. Just the weight of disconnection, the cost of choosing invisibility. And then it buzzed. Just once. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Admiral Kincaid is awake. He's asking for the nurse from the night shift. He keeps saying your call sign. Her call sign. The one name she had buried deeper than all the others. The one name that meant she had been good at something that mattered. The phone call came at 11:41 p.m. Megan's hands were steady when she answered, the way they always were when the world was about to crack open. It was the night charge nurse at Oak Creek Memorial, voice tight with something between confusion and awe. Admiral James Kincaid had opened his eyes. 5 years of silence, 5 years of machines breathing for him, and his eyes had simply opened like a door swinging inward. But that wasn't what made Megan's hand grip the kitchen counter hard enough to hurt. He was asking for someone. One word, over and over, his voice rough from the ventilator tube that had lived in his throat for 60 months. Reaper. The only call sign that existed in a world Megan had burned down and buried in her own name. She drove to the hospital with the rain hammering the windshield like accusations. The parking lot was quiet at midnight, just the sound of her boots on wet asphalt, the kind of deliberate rhythm that comes from muscle memory pretending to be caution. The main lobby had that hospital smell, disinfectant and old coffee, and something underneath that might have been hope or desperation. She could never tell the difference anymore. Room for 47 was on the 3rd floor. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. Her daughter was there. Maya was standing at the Admiral's bedside, and she was holding something. A file. Megan's file. Megan stopped in the doorway, one hand against the frame, because the world had just performed some kind of surgical pivot that she couldn't quite process. Her daughter's voice was trembling as she read aloud. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. 3 tours. Ramady Field Hospital. The words hung in the air like they were physical things, like they had weight. Maya looked up, and Megan watched her daughter's eyes search her face for confirmation of what the file already said, what the Admiral's repeated call sign had already screamed across 5 years of unconsciousness. Everything Megan had carefully constructed, the quiet nurse, the invisible woman, the person who asked no questions and expected none in return, it was over. It had ended the moment a comatose man's brain decided to wake up and remember. A man in dress white stepped into the room then. He was built like a door frame, with a scar that cut from his left temple down past his jawline like a map of somewhere he'd survived. He saluted her first, which meant he knew, which meant everyone was going to know. His name was Marcus Halloway, and he was a Navy SEAL commander, and he had been breathing because of her hands once in Ramady when the dust was still settling and his lung had collapsed like a building after an airstrike. 17 of my men, he said. 17 Marines under his command who should have been zipped into body bags, who were instead standing somewhere in the world right now because she had known where to put a needle and how fast to push air out of a cavity that shouldn't have held any. She kept 17 of my men breathing when command said to evacuate. His voice didn't shake when he said it. Hers didn't either when she finally spoke, which was good, because her daughter was watching and the Admiral was watching and a man in a dark suit was walking toward them with an FBI badge hanging from his neck like an accusation. The agent's name was Chen. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Criminal Fraud Division. He extended a hand and waited for her to shake it, which she did, her grip firm and her eyes locked on his, the way a senior chief was supposed to greet authority that didn't actually have authority over her anymore. "They've been investigating Dr. Sterling for 8 months, he said. Insurance fraud. Phantom procedures. Unnecessary equipment billed to military insurance. He'd assembled a network of accomplices in medical supply, in billing, in administration. The Admiral's case alone represented $847,000 in fraudulent charges. We need your testimony, Chen said. We need someone who's been inside that system. Someone who understands what normal looks like when it's compared to what he was doing." Megan looked at the Admiral. He was watching her with the clarity of a man who had just woken up and remembered what mattered. Her daughter was still holding the file. Commander Holloway was still standing at attention in that way military people never actually stop doing. "I'll testify," Megan said. For words. That was all it took. The hospital board convened emergency session at 6:14 a.m. They did it in the main lobby on purpose, not in some quiet boardroom, but in the open atrium where morning shift staff were arriving, where the news vans were already parking in the loading zone because the FBI doesn't conduct credential revocations quietly. A 2-star Admiral walked through those doors with federal agents flanking him like bookends, and he called Dr. Sterling's name the way authority sounds when it's tired of being patient. The chief of critical care came down from the 3rd floor in a suit that probably cost more than most nurses made in a month. His face was the color of wet concrete. The Admiral read the charges aloud: fraud, conspiracy, abuse of patient care authorization, kickback arrangements with 3 separate medical supply companies, billing for procedures that never occurred. The entire hospital staff stood watching. Megan stood in the back, her uniform still pressed from the Navy, and she watched Dr. Sterling's career collapse like a building detonating from the inside out. His credentials were revoked. His hospital privileges terminated. The board announced a criminal referral. Security escorted him to the parking lot while everyone watched in silence, and that silence was louder than any verdict could have been. 6 months later, Megan was walking past a strip mall in northeast Portland. Rain was falling again, the kind of soft rain that comes in autumn when the sky has given up on drama. There was a folding table outside a tax preparation office, and behind it sat a man with his name on a handwritten sign in letters that bled where the rain had touched them. Sterling Insurance Services. The man looked smaller somehow, hollowed out. He was wearing a polo shirt with a company logo that belonged to no company Megan recognized. His eyes came up when she passed, and for one moment they locked on hers. She was wearing her navy dress whites, medals ribboned across her chest, the navy cross catching the light first, then 2 bronze stars, 2 purple hearts, and the rest of the decorations that said what she had been willing to sacrifice. She didn't slow down. She didn't nod. She kept walking toward the civic center where a ceremony was being held, where she was being recognized for something the world had finally decided it was allowed to call courage. At home, on her mantle, the Admiral's combat boots sat next to her son's flag. They were worn smooth in places, creased deep in others, the leather the color of something that had lived through heat and dust and the weight of decisions. He'd asked her to keep them after waking, after remembering that she was the one who'd been there, who'd understood what it meant to carry impossible weight. The boots smelled like remedy when she held them, like the part of her that had never actually left, that had just been waiting in her hands and her muscle memory and the steady presence that made doctors freeze and patients breathe when breathing seemed impossible. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the force it took to contain everything she had been before she learned to be quiet. Hit that like button now. And I need to know, would you have revealed your identity, or stayed invisible? Drop your answer below. Subscribe so you never miss a story.